The wind howling off the Volga River didn't just bite. It tore at exposed skin like broken glass, each gust carrying particles of ash, pulverized brick, and the metallic scent of frozen blood. Snow fell through what remained of Stalingrad's skyline, settling on twisted steel beams jutting from collapsed buildings like the bones of some prehistoric beast. The temperature had plunged to 30 degrees below zero, transforming the ruined city into a landscape that seemed designed by madness itself. This was Stalingrad in January 1943. A city that had once housed nearly 500,000 people now existed only as an abstraction, a name on maps that bore no resemblance to the nightmare it had become. Where apartment buildings had stood, there were now mountains of rubble. Where streets had run, there were now frozen corpses serving as landmarks for soldiers who could no longer remember what the city had looked like before the world ended. In a basement, somewhere in this frozen hell, a German soldier named Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote in his diary with fingers so numb he could barely hold the pencil. His entries had changed dramatically over the past months. In September, he had written of victory being within reach. In October, he noted that the Russians fought for every house and every floor. By November, he was questioning whether they would survive. Now, in January, his words were simple, stark, filled with a kind of hollow resignation that spoke louder than any elaborate description. He wrote of hunger that gnawed at the mind as much as the body, of cold that made men weep without tears, for tears would freeze on the cheek, of watching comrades fall not from bullets but from simple exhaustion, their bodies giving up the struggle to remain alive in conditions that seemed designed to break the human spirit. A few hundred meters away, across ground contested so fiercely that ownership changed by the hour, a Soviet soldier named Anatoly Kozlov huddled with his squad in the basement of what had once been a school. They had been fighting in Stalingrad for 3 months, though time had lost most of its meaning. Days and nights blurred together into an endless cycle of combat, brief rest, and more combat. Kozlov's unit had arrived with over 100 men. 30 remained, but they had held their positions. They had given ground only when forced, taken it back whenever possible. They had turned Stalingrad into a graveyard for German ambitions. This is the story of the Battle of Stalingrad, the bloodiest single battle in human history. A confrontation so brutal, so utterly consuming, that it redefined what human beings were capable of enduring and inflicting upon each other. It was the battle that broke the Wehrmacht's back, that shattered Hitler's dreams of conquest, that demonstrated to the world that the German war machine was not invincible. But those strategic realities, those geopolitical consequences, were abstractions to the men fighting there. For them, Stalingrad was immediate, personal, apocalyptic. It was the house they defended, the street they attacked, the comrade who died beside them. It was survival measured in minutes and territory measured in meters. The battle lasted from late summer 1942 until early February 1943. Nearly 2 million soldiers fought in and around the city. When it ended, over half of them were dead, wounded, or captured. The Soviet Union suffered approximately 1.1 million casualties. The German Sixth Army and its allies lost more than 800,000 men. Civilian casualties numbered at least 40,000, though the true figure will never be known. These numbers are so vast they become meaningless, just statistics in a history book. But each number represented a person who died in circumstances of unimaginable horror. Understanding Stalingrad requires understanding what brought these armies to this place, what kept them fighting when every instinct screamed to run, and what it cost them to see the battle through to its conclusion. It requires looking past the strategic maps and the grand narratives to see the individual moments of terror and courage that defined the experience. It means confronting the reality that human beings are capable of both extraordinary endurance and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes in the same moment. The city itself had been important long before the war gave it infamy. Situated on the western bank of the Volga River, it was a major industrial center and transportation hub. The factories of Stalingrad produced tanks, weapons, and munitions for the Soviet war effort. The river served as a vital supply line, carrying oil from the Caucasus northward to Soviet armies. Controlling Stalingrad meant controlling the Volga, and controlling the Volga meant strangling Soviet logistics. But the city's importance was more than strategic. It bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself, the Soviet dictator who had risen to power through cunning and ruthlessness and maintained that power through a reign of terror. For Hitler, taking the city named after his ideological nemesis would be a propaganda victory of immense proportions. For Stalin, losing such a city was unthinkable. This personal dimension, this clash of egos at the highest level, would help transform what might have been a significant but manageable battle into an all-consuming bloodbath neither side could afford to lose. The battle would see innovations in urban warfare that remain relevant today. It would produce heroes whose names are still remembered and horrors whose details still shock. It would demonstrate the limits of military technology when faced with determined resistance in an urban environment. Most importantly, it would prove that the German Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe with apparent ease, could be defeated. Not just defeated in some minor skirmish, but utterly destroyed, annihilated so thoroughly that an entire army simply ceased to exist. This is that story. The story of how Stalingrad became a charnel house, how hundreds of thousands died fighting over rubble that had no military value beyond the symbolic, how the course of World War II and perhaps human history pivoted on the banks of the Volga River. It's a story of suffering and sacrifice, of tactical brilliance and strategic blundering, of ordinary men pushed far beyond what they thought they could endure. And it begins, as so many catastrophes do, with hubris and ambition. The Road to Hell, Operation Barbarossa and Blue. On June the 22nd, 1941, the largest invasion force ever assembled crossed the Soviet border. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft, launched Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's plan was simple in concept: destroy the Soviet Union in a single massive campaign before winter arrived. The Führer and his generals believed the Red Army, weakened by Stalin's purges and humiliated by its poor performance in the winter war against Finland, would collapse within weeks. For a time, it seemed they were right. German panzer divisions raced across the steppes, encircling entire Soviet armies. Within the first month, the Wehrmacht had advanced over 300 miles and inflicted millions of casualties. Cities fell. Prisoners were taken in numbers so large that the Germans struggled to process them, and the Soviet Union seemed on the verge of collapse. But it didn't collapse. Despite catastrophic losses, despite entire armies being surrounded and destroyed, despite losing vast territories and millions of soldiers, the Red Army kept fighting. The German advance stalled in the winter of 1941 before Moscow. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht not only failed to achieve its objective but was actually pushed back. The Soviet winter offensive, launched in December, drove German forces away from the capital and inflicted heavy casualties. More importantly, it demonstrated that the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had conquered Poland, France, and the Balkans, had limits. Against an enemy with vast reserves of manpower and territory, against an enemy fighting for its survival, speed and shock were not enough. Hitler, convinced that the 1941 campaign had failed because of strategic errors rather than fundamental flaws in the plan, prepared a new offensive for 1942. But this time, the objectives were different. Instead of trying to capture Moscow, the Wehrmacht would drive south, aiming to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare. Germany's access to petroleum was limited, making the campaign dependent on Romanian oil fields. Capturing the Soviet oil fields would solve Germany's supply problems while simultaneously strangling the Soviet war machine. The plan, codenamed Operation Blue, called for Army Group South to drive toward the Caucasus while simultaneously securing the flank along the Volga River. This is where Stalingrad became important. The city needed to be taken to protect the flank of the armies driving into the Caucasus. It was a supporting objective, important but not the main goal of the offensive. Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 41, outlining the plan. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, would be responsible for taking Stalingrad. The deadline was set for August 25, 1942. Paulus was a careful, methodical officer, a staff officer by training and temperament. He had never commanded troops in combat before receiving command of the Sixth Army, and he owed his position partly to his willingness to follow orders without question. This would prove significant later when the question of disobeying Hitler arose. But in the summer of 1942, as Operation Blue got underway, Paulus and his army represented the cutting edge of German military power. The Sixth Army was experienced, well-equipped, and confident after years of victory. The offensive began on June 28, 1942, and initially proceeded according to plan. Soviet forces, still reeling from the disasters of 1941 and a disastrous offensive at Kharkov in May, fell back before the German advance. Cities fell, prisoners were taken, and once again it seemed the Wehrmacht was unstoppable. By late July, German forces were approaching Stalingrad. The city's defenders were desperately unprepared. The Soviet 62nd Army, assigned to defend Stalingrad, was understrength and poorly equipped. Many of its soldiers were recent conscripts with minimal training. The city itself had been a backwater, far from the front lines for the first year of the war. Now, suddenly, it was the front line, and the storm was approaching fast. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad grew as the offensive continued. What had been a supporting objective became increasingly central to his planning. On July 17, 1942, Hitler issued a new directive declaring that Stalingrad must be taken at all costs. This decision, driven by the symbolic importance of the city's name, would prove catastrophic. It meant that German forces would not bypass the city or simply isolate it. They would fight for it, street by street if necessary, until it was completely under German control. Stalin, for his part, was equally obsessed with holding the city that bore his name. The idea of losing it was psychologically and politically intolerable. On July 28, 1942, he issued Order No. 227, known as Not One Step Back. The order was brutal in its simplicity. Soviet forces would hold their positions. Retreat without orders would be considered treason. Commanders who allowed their units to retreat would be arrested. Blocking detachments would be positioned behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot anyone who tried to flee. Cowards would be sent to penal battalions for suicide missions. This order reflected Stalin's recognition that the Red Army's morale was fragile after a year of catastrophic defeats. But it also reflected his willingness to accept any casualties, any suffering, to achieve his objectives. The soldiers defending Stalingrad would have nowhere to retreat. They would fight and die where they stood, or they would be executed by their own side. This created a psychological dynamic that would define the battle. German soldiers fighting for prestige and ideology, Soviet soldiers fighting with their backs literally to the wall, knowing that defeat meant death whether from German or Soviet bullets. By late August, the Luftwaffe was ready to begin the preliminary bombardment that would soften up the city before the ground assault. On August 23, 1942, over 1,000 German aircraft appeared over Stalingrad and began dropping bombs. The attack continued for hours, waves of bombers appearing overhead, unloading their deadly cargo and returning for more. The city had no effective air defenses. The bombing was practically unopposed. In a single day, the Luftwaffe turned much of Stalingrad into rubble. Entire districts were leveled. Wooden buildings burned in firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. The oil storage tanks along the Volga caught fire, creating an inferno that burned for days and covered the river in flaming oil, making evacuation nearly impossible. Civilian casualties were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that over 40,000 civilians died in the initial bombing, though exact figures will never be known. Many bodies were simply incinerated in the firestorms. The survivors huddled in basements, in sewers, in any shelter they could find. Stalin had refused to evacuate the civilian population, believing that soldiers would fight harder to defend a living city than an empty one. This decision condemned tens of thousands of civilians to death. Those who survived the bombing found themselves trapped in a city that was about to become a battlefield, with nowhere to go and no way to escape. The German ground assault began in early September. Paulus's Sixth Army, supported by elements of the Fourth Panzer Army, drove into the city from the west and south. They expected to take Stalingrad within days. The city was already in ruins, the Soviet defenders were outnumbered and outgunned, and German forces had overwhelming advantages in armor and air support. By every reasonable military calculation, Stalingrad should have fallen quickly. But something happened that the German planners hadn't anticipated. The rubble that their bombs and artillery had created became a fortress for the defenders. The ruins of apartment buildings became strongpoints. Collapsed walls created natural cover. The shattered cityscape negated German advantages in tanks and air power. Urban warfare, especially in a city that had been bombed into ruins, favored defenders who knew the terrain and were willing to fight for every position. The Battle of Stalingrad had begun. What followed would be 5 months of the most brutal close-quarters combat ever recorded. The city became a maze of death, where survival was measured in hours and territory in meters, where soldiers lived in constant fear, exhaustion, and hunger, where the line between courage and madness blurred until they became indistinguishable, where human beings discovered depths of endurance and cruelty they hadn't known existed. The road to Stalingrad had been paved with ambition and hubris. The battle itself would be paved with corpses. Rattenkrieg, the storm and the grinding. The Germans had a word for it. Rattenkrieg, rat war. It captured something essential about combat in Stalingrad, something that conventional military terminology couldn't quite express. This wasn't warfare as generals conceived it, with clear front lines and coordinated maneuvers. This was fighting in sewers and basements, in stairwells and attics, through holes blown in walls separating apartments. This was war reduced to its most primal, brutal essence. German soldiers who had marched triumphantly through the streets of Paris and Kiev found themselves fighting for individual rooms in bombed-out apartment buildings. Trained for open warfare, for rapid advances behind armor and air support, they struggled with the claustrophobic nightmare that Stalingrad had become. Tanks, which had been decisive in earlier campaigns, were vulnerable in the narrow streets and rubble-choked ruins. A Soviet soldier with an anti-tank rifle could hide in a basement, wait for a tank to pass, and fire at its vulnerable underside or rear. Air power, which had given Germany such an advantage, was less effective against defenders who simply went underground when the bombs started falling. The Soviet 62nd Army, under General Vasily Zaytsev, developed tactics specifically designed for urban warfare in ruins. Small units, often just a handful of men, would fortify individual buildings or even individual floors. They would hold these positions as long as possible, inflicting casualties on attacking Germans before falling back to the next position. The goal wasn't to prevent German advances entirely, but to make every meter of ground cost blood. To slow the Germans, to bleed them, to prevent them from ever establishing the kind of momentum that had carried them across so much of Europe. Zaytsev understood something fundamental about fighting in Stalingrad. The closer Soviet forces stayed to German positions, the less effective German artillery and air power became. If Soviet and German forces were intermixed, locked together in close combat, the Germans couldn't call in bombardments without hitting their own troops. So Zaytsev's order was simple: hug the enemy. Stay so close to German positions that the two forces were inseparable. Force the Germans to fight at ranges measured in meters rather than kilometers. This created a terrifying intimacy to the combat. Soldiers fought at ranges where they could see each other's faces, hear each other's voices. Grenades became primary weapons, tossed through windows and down stairwells. Submachine guns were preferred over rifles because most combat happened at ranges where accuracy mattered less than volume of fire. Knives and sharpened entrenching tools became common weapons when ammunition ran out or when combat was too close even for firearms. The fighting followed patterns, yet each engagement was unique. A German assault would typically begin with artillery fire, shells screaming in to pulverize a Soviet position. Then infantry would advance, often supported by a few tanks if the terrain permitted. Soviet defenders would wait, holding fire until the Germans were close, then unleashing everything they had. Machine guns would chatter, grenades would explode, and for a few minutes the noise would be overwhelming, a physical force that left ears ringing and minds stunned. If the Germans took a position, Soviet counterattacks would come almost immediately. Small groups of soldiers would infiltrate through the ruins, approaching from unexpected directions, and assault the Germans before they could properly fortify their newly won position. These counterattacks were often suicidal, but they served their purpose. They kept the Germans off balance, prevented them from consolidating gains, forced them to constantly worry about attacks from any direction. Night brought different horrors. Darkness in Stalingrad was never complete. Fires burned throughout the city, casting flickering orange light that created shifting shadows and turned every piece of rubble into a potential threat. Both sides used the darkness for infiltration and attack. Soviet scouts would crawl through no man's land, gathering intelligence or simply trying to get close enough to German positions to throw grenades. German patrols would probe Soviet defenses, trying to find weak points for the next day's assault. Sleep became a precious commodity, measured in minutes rather than hours. Soldiers learned to sleep despite the noise, despite the cold, despite hunger and fear and exhaustion. They learned to sleep through artillery bombardments, waking only if the pattern of fire suggested an imminent assault. They learned to function on an hour of sleep here, 30 minutes there, their minds adapting to a state of constant semi-consciousness that was neither fully awake nor truly asleep. Food was scarce on both sides, but Soviet soldiers suffered more. Supply lines across the Volga were under constant German bombardment. Boats crossing the river were prime targets for artillery and aircraft. Many supply runs failed, with boats sunk or driven back, their precious cargo of food and ammunition lost. Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad often subsisted on a few hundred grams of bread per day, supplemented by whatever they could scavenge. They learned to eat things civilians would reject, to drink water that was barely fit for consumption, to survive on a fraction of the calories the human body normally needs. German soldiers initially had better supply lines, but as the battle dragged on and Soviet resistance refused to collapse, their situation also deteriorated. Ammunition had to be rationed. Food supplies dwindled. The cold, when winter arrived, became a constant enemy for both sides. Frostbite was endemic. Soldiers learned to check their extremities constantly, looking for the white, numb flesh that indicated the beginning of frostbite. Severe cases required amputation, but even in less severe cases, men lost toes or fingers to the cold. Medical care was primitive under these conditions. Soviet wounded were evacuated across the Volga if possible, but many died waiting for boats that never came. German wounded fared somewhat better initially, but medical facilities were overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties. Surgery was performed in basements lit by candles or kerosene lamps without proper anesthesia, with instruments that couldn't be properly sterilized. Infection killed many men who might have survived their wounds under better conditions. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. Soldiers on both sides witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They saw friends killed in sudden, brutal ways. They saw civilians caught in the crossfire, their bodies left to rot because no one could reach them to provide burial. They lived in constant fear, knowing that death could come at any moment from any direction. A sniper's bullet, a random artillery shell, a grenade through a window, a ceiling collapse, 1,000 different ways to die, and no way to predict or prevent them. Some men broke under the strain. On the Soviet side, this often meant execution or, at best, assignment to a penal battalion for a suicide mission. On the German side, psychiatric casualties were evacuated when possible, but many simply continued fighting in a state of mental breakdown, their effectiveness reduced, but their bodies still present. The line between courage and trauma-induced numbness became difficult to distinguish. Men who seemed fearless might actually be too psychologically damaged to feel fear anymore. The city itself became a landscape of surreal horror. Corpses lay everywhere, frozen in winter, decomposing in the brief autumn warmth. Some were buried, but many simply remained where they fell, becoming part of the terrain. Landmarks were defined by death: the burned-out tank, the building with the collapsed facade, the street corner where a pile of bodies created an improvised barricade. The normal human responses to death, the shock and grief, became muted. There were too many corpses, too much death, for each individual case to register emotionally. Animals fled the city when they could. Dogs and cats tried to swim across the Volga, desperate to escape. Many drowned, but some made it, driven by instincts that told them this place was death, that survival meant leaving. Rats, however, thrived. They fed on the corpses, grew fat and bold, and became a constant presence. Soldiers woke to find rats crawling over them, searching for food. The rodents spread disease, but they also served a purpose. When artillery bombardments buried soldiers alive, rats gnawing at their faces would wake them, giving them a chance to dig themselves out. Water pipes burst from the cold or from shelling, creating problems with sanitation. Human waste piled up, adding its stench to the smell of death and smoke that permeated everything. Diseases spread. Dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses weakened men already pushed to the edge of endurance. The cumulative effect of poor nutrition, inadequate sleep, constant stress, and unsanitary conditions created a health crisis that killed many soldiers without enemy action. Communication between units was difficult and unreliable. Telephone lines were constantly cut by shell fire. Radio equipment was scarce and could be destroyed or captured. Messengers had to physically traverse the battlefield, often through areas under heavy fire. Orders were frequently outdated by the time they arrived, as the fluid nature of the combat meant the situation could change completely within hours or even minutes. Yet, despite all this, the battle continued. Men on both sides, pushed beyond what they thought they could endure, found reserves of strength they didn't know existed. They fought not because they wanted to, not even always because they believed in their cause, but because the alternative was unthinkable. German soldiers fought because retreat would mean abandoning comrades, facing Hitler's wrath, and admitting that their sacrifices had been for nothing. Soviet soldiers fought because retreat was impossible, because their families depended on them, because surrendering to the Germans meant a death perhaps worse than dying in combat. The battle developed a rhythm over the weeks and months. German assaults would take positions at heavy cost. Soviet counterattacks would retake some positions. The front line would shift, sometimes by hundreds of meters, more often by just a few dozen. The cost in lives for these small territorial gains was appalling. A single building might change hands multiple times, with hundreds dying in the process. Yet neither side could break through, couldn't achieve the decisive breakthrough that would end the struggle. By late autumn, the Germans controlled most of Stalingrad. They held roughly 90% of the city's ruins. Soviet forces clung to a few pockets along the Volga, their backs literally to the river, with nowhere to retreat. But those few pockets remained unconquered. The Soviets held the Barricadi factory district, the Red October factory complex, and several key buildings that gave them observation over German positions. These strongpoints, defended with desperate ferocity, prevented the Germans from ever completely taking the city. It was in these strongpoints, in these last bastions of resistance, that some of the battle's most famous episodes occurred, places that would become symbols of the larger struggle, buildings that represented something beyond their tactical value, that came to embody the stubborn refusal of Soviet forces to accept defeat. Places like Pavlov's house, the fortress, Pavlov's house, and symbols of resistance. In late September 1942, a four-story apartment building near the center of Stalingrad took on an importance far beyond what its unremarkable architecture would suggest. The building, located on what had been called 9th of January Square, had a commanding view of the surrounding area. From its upper floors, observers could see German positions to the west, north, and south. For the Germans trying to push through to the Volga, this building was an obstacle. For the Soviets trying to hold the line, it was a fortress. Junior Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led a small reconnaissance group tasked with determining if the building was still occupied by German forces. On September 27th, his squad approached the building under heavy fire. The assault was costly. In the fighting to clear the Germans out, most of Pavlov's men were killed, leaving just a handful of survivors. But they took the building, and Pavlov, along with his remaining soldiers, immediately began preparing defenses. What made this particular building significant was its position and structure. The apartment building was built perpendicular to the Volga embankment, giving defenders clear lines of sight in multiple directions. It was solidly constructed, with thick walls that could withstand artillery fire better than many structures in the city. The basement provided shelter during bombardments. Upper floors gave excellent observation and firing positions. In the landscape of ruins that Stalingrad had become, this building was remarkably intact and ideally positioned. Days after Pavlov's initial assault, reinforcements arrived under the command of Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev. The reinforcements brought the garrison up to roughly 25 to 30 men, along with heavy machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and mortars. With these additional weapons and troops, the building became a genuine strongpoint. Under Afanasyev's command, with Pavlov leading one of the squads, the defenders began fortifying their position. They worked with whatever materials they could find. Sandbags filled with rubble were stacked in windows to create firing ports while providing protection. Barbed wire, scavenged from destroyed fortifications elsewhere in the city, was strung in layers around the building. Mines were planted in approaches to the square, creating kill zones that would channel German attacks into pre-registered fields of fire. Machine gun nests were established at key windows, positioned to provide overlapping fire that would make any approach across the square suicidal. The anti-tank rifles proved particularly effective. In the early stages of the defense, Pavlov discovered that mounting an anti-tank rifle on the roof allowed for devastating attacks on German armor. When tanks approached to within 25 meters or so of the building, their thin top armor became exposed to fire from above. But the tanks couldn't elevate their guns high enough to return fire effectively. Using this tactic, Pavlov personally destroyed nearly a dozen tanks, teaching the Germans that armor was vulnerable near the building. The Germans recognized the building's importance and attacked it repeatedly. Multiple times per day, German infantry would attempt to cross the square and assault the building. Each time, the defenders would unleash withering fire from their prepared positions. Machine guns would rake the square. Mortars would drop shells among the attacking troops. Anti-tank rifles would disable any armored support. The Germans would suffer heavy casualties and fall back, only to try again hours later. The intensity of these attacks varied. Sometimes they were probing attacks, small groups testing the defenses. Other times they were major assaults with hundreds of men supported by artillery preparation. The defenders learned to distinguish between different types of attacks by the pattern of preliminary bombardment and the size of the attacking force. They learned to husband their ammunition, firing at maximum effect only when necessary, conserving rounds for the next assault they knew would come. Supply and reinforcement for the defenders came primarily at night, when darkness provided some cover from German observation. A communications trench connected the building to Soviet lines closer to the Volga. Boats would cross the river under cover of night, bringing supplies to Soviet-held positions along the embankment, and then runners would bring ammunition, food, and water through the trenches to Pavlov's house. This supply line was precarious, constantly under threat, but it kept the defenders fighting. Throughout the siege, civilians remained in the building's basement. They had taken shelter there during the initial bombing of Stalingrad and had nowhere else to go. The defenders shared their meager rations with these civilians, and, in return, the civilians helped in small ways. They carried ammunition, helped tend to wounded soldiers, provided moral support simply through their presence. One woman gave birth in the basement during the siege, a moment of life emerging amid so much death. The defenders considered themselves godfathers to the child, and the woman later said she viewed all the building's defenders as her child's godfathers. The Germans came to refer to the building as a fortress on their maps. They significantly overestimated the number of defenders, believing that such determined resistance must come from a much larger force. In reality, the garrison never exceeded about 30 men at any given time. According to most accounts, the defenders suffered remarkably few casualties during the siege, though both Pavlov and Afanasyev were wounded. The building came to symbolize Soviet resistance in Stalingrad. It demonstrated that properly fortified positions in urban terrain could resist seemingly overwhelming force. It showed that small groups of determined soldiers could hold critical ground against much larger enemy forces. Most importantly, it represented defiance. Here was a building, an ordinary apartment complex that refused to fall despite everything the Germans threw at it. General Vasily Zaytsev, commanding the 62nd Army, later made a comment that captured the building's symbolic importance. He said that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they lost taking Paris. This was almost certainly an exaggeration, but it reflected the frustration and respect the building generated. The Germans had conquered the French capital, one of the great cities of Europe, in a matter of weeks. But they couldn't take a single apartment building in Stalingrad despite 2 months of constant attacks. The siege of Pavlov's house lasted from September 27th to November 25th, 1942. When Soviet forces finally launched their major counteroffensive and pushed German forces back, the building was relieved. The defenders, exhausted and emaciated but still fighting, were withdrawn from the position. The building had held for 58 days, exactly as ordered. After the war, Pavlov's house was among the first buildings reconstructed in Stalingrad. One wall was left in its damaged state and turned into a memorial, with bricks from the original structure incorporated into the design. The inscription reads, "In this building were united heroic feats of warfare and labor. We will defend and rebuild you, dear Stalingrad." The building still stands today in modern Volgograd, still used as an apartment building, a reminder of the battle and the men who fought there. Pavlov himself survived the war and was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union in 1945. He left the military in 1946 with the rank of lieutenant and became involved in politics, serving 3 terms as a deputy in the Supreme Soviet. When he died in 1981, he was buried with honors, remembered as the man who helped hold the house that wouldn't fall. It's worth noting that Soviet propaganda played a significant role in shaping the story of Pavlov's house. While the defense was genuine and the building was strategically important, the narrative emphasized certain dramatic elements while downplaying others. Lieutenant Afanasyev was the actual commander for most of the siege, but Pavlov's name became attached to the building in Soviet accounts, likely because it made for a more compelling propaganda story. This doesn't diminish the courage of the defenders, but it does remind us that wartime accounts are often shaped by the needs of morale and national narrative. But Pavlov's house was just one of many strongpoints in Stalingrad, where small groups of Soviet soldiers held positions against overwhelming odds. The Barricadi factory saw weeks of fighting among its machinery and blast furnaces. The Red October steel plant became a fortress where workers and soldiers fought side by side. The grain elevator near the Volga was defended by 50 men who held off German assaults for days before being overrun. Each of these positions had its own story, its own defenders who fought with the same desperate courage. The pattern was consistent: fortified positions, determined defenders, repeated German attacks, and stubborn resistance. The cumulative effect of these many small stands was to slow the German advance to a crawl. Territory was measured in meters. Time was measured in blood. And while these small groups of infantry held their positions, another kind of war was being waged in the ruins. A war of precision and patience. A war of hunters and prey. The hunter, Vasily Zaytsev, and the sniper war, in the chaos of Stalingrad, where thousands died in anonymous masses, certain individuals emerged whose actions seemed to transcend the larger carnage. Among Soviet defenders, no figure became more famous than Vasily Grigorievich Zaytsev, the sniper whose kills were meticulously recorded and whose legend grew with each confirmed shot. Zaytsev arrived in Stalingrad in September 1942 as part of the 1,047th Rifle Regiment of the 284th Rifle Division. He was 26 years old, a sailor in the Soviet Pacific Fleet who had been transferred to the infantry when the need for reinforcements became desperate. Unlike many conscripts thrust into combat with minimal preparation, Zaytsev brought valuable skills. He had grown up in the Ural Mountains, hunting deer and wolves from a young age. His grandfather had taught him to shoot, emphasizing patience, stillness, and the importance of that first shot. In the forests of the Urals, you rarely got a second chance. Those childhood lessons translated remarkably well to urban warfare. Stalingrad's ruins created a sniper's paradise, full of hiding spots with clear fields of fire. A skilled marksman could hide in a bombed-out building, wait for hours without moving, then take a single carefully aimed shot before repositioning. The psychological effect of snipers was disproportionate to the actual casualties they inflicted. Soldiers learned to fear any open space, any movement that might expose them to an unseen marksman's crosshairs. Zaytsev's first kills in Stalingrad came within days of his arrival. Using a standard Mosin-Nagant rifle with a PU scope, he began hunting German officers and NCOs. The logic was simple. Leadership casualties disrupted German operations more than killing ordinary soldiers. A dead lieutenant meant a platoon without experienced command. A dead sergeant meant a squad without its most capable member. Each such kill rippled outward, degrading German effectiveness beyond the simple mathematics of one less enemy soldier. His technique was methodical. He would arrive at a position before dawn, while darkness still provided cover. He would prepare his hide, ensuring he had good sight lines and multiple routes of escape. Then he would wait. Hours might pass without a suitable target appearing. When one did appear, Zaytsev would calculate range, wind, and other factors affecting the bullet's trajectory. Then, controlling his breathing and heartbeat, he would squeeze the trigger. The rifle would crack, the target would fall, and Zaytsev would immediately begin repositioning, knowing that German soldiers would start searching for his location. By early October, his kill count had risen dramatically. Soviet commanders recognized his talent and began using him not just as a sniper, but as an instructor. In a city where ammunition had to be carefully rationed, where every bullet counted, teaching soldiers to make those bullets count became crucial. Zaytsev began training other snipers, passing on the techniques his grandfather had taught him and the new urban warfare adaptations he had developed. The training focused on fundamentals. Patience above all else. The ability to remain motionless for hours, ignoring discomfort, waiting for the perfect shot. Camouflage and concealment, using rubble and shadows to blend into the environment. Range estimation without obvious tools. Reading wind and weather conditions. Most importantly, the mentality of the hunter. Calm, focused, utterly committed to the kill. Zaytsev's trainees formed what became known as a sniper movement in the 62nd Army. Dozens, then hundreds of Soviet soldiers received sniper training. They formed teams, working in pairs for mutual support and security. The systematic approach to sniper warfare that emerged from this training significantly increased Soviet effectiveness. German soldiers, already struggling with the brutal house-to-house fighting, now faced the additional threat of expert marksmen who could kill from hundreds of meters away. The Germans responded with their own snipers. The Wehrmacht had a tradition of marksmanship, and German optics were generally superior to Soviet equivalents. German snipers began hunting the Soviet hunters, creating a deadly game within the larger battle. Sniper duels became common, with each side trying to locate and eliminate the other's marksman. It's here that the most famous story associated with Zaytsev enters the narrative: his alleged duel with a German sniper ace named Erwin König. According to the story popularized in books and the film Enemy at the Gates, König was a master sniper sent specifically to kill Zaytsev. The duel supposedly lasted days, with both men stalking each other through the ruins, each trying to outwit the other. Finally, Zaytsev managed to trick König into exposing himself and killed him with a single shot. The truth of this story remains heavily disputed among historians. There's no German military record of a sniper named Erwin König serving at Stalingrad. The timeline doesn't work. German sniper schools were only established in mid-1942, leaving insufficient time for König to have achieved the legendary status claimed in Soviet accounts. British historian Anthony Beevor, after reviewing Russian Ministry of Defense archives, concluded the duel was likely created by Soviet propaganda. Some historians believe the story may have been based on a real sniper duel, perhaps with a different German sniper, but the details were embellished for propaganda purposes. Zaytsev himself wrote about the duel in his memoirs, describing König as the head of a Berlin sniper school, but the account appears to have been influenced by wartime propaganda rather than documentary evidence. The story served an important purpose during the war. It gave Soviet soldiers and civilians a hero to rally behind, a David who could defeat the German Goliath. Whether the specific duel happened as described matters less, perhaps, than what it represented: Soviet skill and determination matching German military prowess. What's not disputed is Zaytsev's effectiveness as a sniper. Soviet records credit him with 225 confirmed kills during the Battle of Stalingrad, though the actual number was likely higher, as not all kills could be confirmed. Each confirmed kill required a witness or physical verification, which wasn't always possible in the chaos of combat. Some estimates place his total kills significantly higher, but the documented figure of 225 is what appears in official records. The impact of Zaytsev's work extended beyond the actual casualties he inflicted. He became a propaganda tool for Soviet morale. Newspaper articles told of his exploits. Soldiers heard stories of the deadly sniper who was making the Germans pay for every meter of Stalingrad. His success inspired others to volunteer for sniper training. The psychological warfare element was significant. German soldiers knew there was a legendary Soviet sniper operating in their sector, and that knowledge created anxiety, hesitation, and fear. On January 10, 1943, Zaytsev's combat role at Stalingrad ended when he was severely wounded. A mortar shell exploded near his position, and shrapnel temporarily blinded him. He was evacuated across the Volga and eventually to a Moscow hospital, where Professor Vladimir Filatov, a pioneering ophthalmologist, operated on his eyes. The surgery was successful, and Zaytsev eventually regained most of his sight, though his vision was never quite what it had been. He returned to combat in 1943, fighting in the Battle of the Dnieper and other engagements. He continued training snipers, sharing his expertise with new generations of Soviet marksmen. By the war's end, he had trained over 28 snipers who themselves achieved significant success. His students collectively were credited with over 3,000 kills, creating a multiplier effect that made Zaytsev's contribution to the war effort far greater than his personal tally suggested. After the war, Zaytsev was recognized as a hero of the Soviet Union in 1943. He remained in the military until 1946, then worked in a factory in Kiev. He died in 1991, shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union he had fought to defend. In 2006, his remains were reburied with full military honors at the War Memorial at Mamayev Kurgan in Volgograd, the city that had been Stalingrad. His grave overlooks the battlefield where he made his name, where he hunted and was hunted, where he became one of history's most famous snipers. The sniper war in Stalingrad represented a particular kind of combat within the larger battle. While infantry fought for buildings and tanks battled in the streets, snipers waged their own private war. It was intimate in its own way, a duel between individuals across distances measured in hundreds of meters. Each sniper knew the other was out there, searching, waiting, planning. The psychological tension was extreme. Every piece of cover might hide an enemy marksman. Every moment of exposure might be your last. Soviet snipers adopted various tactics to stay ahead of their German counterparts. They used decoys, dummy positions that would draw fire and reveal enemy sniper locations. They worked in pairs, with one sniper serving as the shooter and the other as a spotter and security. They varied their patterns, never using the same hide twice in a row, never establishing predictable routines. The successful snipers were those who combined marksmanship with fieldcraft, who understood that staying alive was as important as making kills. German snipers were equally skilled and resourceful. They had better optics in many cases, with Zeiss scopes that were clearer and more precise than Soviet equivalents. They had training schools that taught systematic approaches to sniping. But they struggled with the same problems affecting all German forces in Stalingrad. They were operating in an environment that favored defenders, fighting an enemy that knew the terrain intimately and was willing to accept any casualties to hold their positions. The sniper war also had a darker side. Captured snipers were rarely treated according to the rules of war. Both sides viewed snipers as a special category of enemy, deserving of harsher treatment than regular soldiers. There are accounts of summary executions, of captured snipers being tortured for information before being killed. The intimate nature of sniper warfare, the deliberate selection of individual targets, seemed to provoke a particularly visceral hatred. Snipers targeted more than just enemy soldiers. They shot at anyone who exposed themselves, medics trying to reach wounded soldiers, engineers trying to clear obstacles, even civilians who ventured into contested areas. The effect was to make every open space potentially deadly, to create zones where no one could move safely during daylight hours. This slowed operations on both sides, but it particularly hindered German offensive efforts as attacks required movement and exposure. The memoirs and accounts of Stalingrad survivors frequently mention the sniper threat. Soldiers learned to move in short bursts, dashing from cover to cover rather than walking normally. They learned to use smoke and dust for concealment. They learned never to establish predictable patterns, never to expose themselves unnecessarily. The lesson was reinforced by the bodies of those who forgot or didn't learn fast enough. A soldier who stood up at the wrong moment, who paused in an exposed position, who created a silhouette against the sky, would be dead before the rifle crack reached his comrade's ears. Zaytsev and his fellow snipers represented an evolution in warfare. They weren't the first military snipers, but they helped establish sniping as a specialized role requiring dedicated training and equipment. The techniques developed in Stalingrad's ruins influenced sniper doctrine for decades afterward. Modern military sniper training still includes many of the same fundamentals Zaytsev taught his students: patience, camouflage, precision, and the hunter's mentality. But while snipers fought their individual duels and infantry struggled for buildings, larger strategic developments were taking shape. The Soviet High Command, watching German forces grind themselves down in Stalingrad, was preparing a counteroffensive. One that would not just stop the German advance but would trap and destroy an entire German army. The greatest encirclement battle in history was about to begin. Operation Uranus, the jaws close. While the world's attention focused on the brutal street fighting in Stalingrad itself, Soviet planners were preparing a masterstroke. General Georgy Zhukov, arguably the Soviet Union's most capable military commander, had been studying the situation around Stalingrad for weeks. What he saw was an opportunity unprecedented in the war so far. The German Sixth Army, along with elements of the Fourth Panzer Army, was fully committed to taking Stalingrad. Over 250,000 German and Axis soldiers were locked in combat in and around the city, focused entirely on the fight immediately in front of them. But this concentration of force created a vulnerability. The flanks of the German position were held not by German troops but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units. These Allied forces were generally less well equipped than German troops. They had fewer tanks, less artillery, older weapons. Their training was inferior, and their morale was questionable. Many were reluctant participants in Hitler's war, present more from political necessity than genuine commitment to the cause. Soviet intelligence had identified these weaknesses and recognized them as the key to a potential counteroffensive. The plan Zhukov and his staff developed was codenamed Operation Uranus. It called for simultaneous attacks north and south of Stalingrad, striking at the weakest points of the German defensive line. These attacks would punch through the Romanian positions, then drive deep into the German rear, eventually meeting somewhere west of Stalingrad. If successful, the operation would completely encircle all German forces in and around the city, cutting them off from supplies and reinforcements. The preparation for Operation Uranus was massive and conducted with impressive secrecy. Soviet forces had been gathering reserves behind their lines for weeks, but they had hidden this buildup through careful deception measures. Troop movements happened at night. Tanks and artillery were camouflaged. Radio traffic was kept to minimum to prevent German signals intelligence from detecting the buildup. Dummy positions were created to make German reconnaissance believe Soviet forces were weaker than they actually were. By mid-November, the Soviets had assembled over 1 million men for the operation. They had 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and over 100 aircraft. This represented a dramatic recovery from the disasters of 1941 and early 1942. Soviet industry, relocated east of the Urals and operating at maximum capacity, was producing weapons in quantities that were beginning to match or exceed German production. The balance of forces was shifting, though the Germans didn't yet realize how dramatically. The attack was scheduled for November 19, 1942. The night before, Soviet soldiers in their jumping-off positions prepared for battle. Many wrote final letters home, understanding that the coming assault would be costly. Others tried to sleep, knowing rest would be scarce once the offensive began. Officers reviewed plans one last time, checking maps, confirming objectives, making sure every unit knew its role. Artillery crews prepared their guns, stacking shells within easy reach, calculating firing data for their initial bombardments. At 07:20 on November 19th, the Soviet artillery opened fire. Over 3,500 guns and mortars began a bombardment that lasted 80 minutes. The shells rained down on Romanian positions north of Stalingrad, pulverizing fortifications, severing communication lines, and creating chaos in the defensive positions. Romanian soldiers who had been told they faced weak Soviet forces on the verge of collapse found themselves under a bombardment of unprecedented intensity. The frozen ground shook. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar that made thought impossible, that reduced men to terrified animals seeking any shelter from the storm of steel. When the bombardment lifted, Soviet infantry and tanks advanced through the morning fog. The Romanian Third Army, holding the northern flank, was already reeling from the artillery preparation. Now they faced waves of Soviet soldiers supported by tanks appearing out of the fog like mechanical ghosts. Romanian units fought in some areas, surrendered en masse in others, or simply fled in confusion. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had punched through the Romanian lines and were driving south into the German rear. The southern attack began on November 20th. Soviet forces struck Romanian positions south of Stalingrad with the same overwhelming force. Again, preparatory bombardments shattered defensive positions. Again, Soviet armor and infantry pushed through shaken defenders and began driving north. The two Soviet pincers were converging, and between them, the German Sixth Army was beginning to realize it was in mortal danger. German commanders reacted with confusion and disbelief. Reports from the flanks were fragmentary and alarming, but many German officers initially dismissed them as exaggerations or local setbacks that could be contained. General Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, was focused on the fighting in Stalingrad itself and slow to recognize the magnitude of the threat to his flanks. By the time the danger became undeniable, it was already too late to prevent the encirclement. On November 22nd, Soviet forces from the northern and southern offensives met near the town of Kalak, about 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The link-up was almost anticlimactic, units from different Soviet armies meeting in a small village and confirming by radio that the encirclement was complete. But the implications were staggering. The German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations, was completely surrounded. Over 250,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped in what the Germans would come to call the Kessel, the cauldron. The shock in German high command was profound. Never before had an entire German army been encircled. Individual divisions had been surrounded and destroyed in the first months of Barbarossa. But this was different. This was a catastrophic operational failure that called into question the entire German strategy. Hitler, receiving news of the encirclement, initially refused to believe it was as serious as his generals claimed. He convinced himself that the trapped forces could hold a defensive perimeter until relief forces broke through. Paulus and his staff immediately began planning a breakout. The obvious move was to attack westward, trying to break through the Soviet encirclement before it solidified. But any such operation would require abandoning Stalingrad, abandoning the heavy equipment and supplies that couldn't be moved quickly, and accepting significant casualties during the breakout attempt. More critically, it would require Hitler's permission, and Hitler had already made clear his thinking. On November 24th, Hitler issued explicit orders. The Sixth Army would hold its positions and form a hedgehog defense. There would be no retreat, no breakout attempt. Instead, the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air until ground forces could break through the Soviet encirclement from outside. This decision, made hundreds of kilometers away from the reality of the situation, sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. The airlift decision was based on unrealistic assumptions. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had assured Hitler that his aircraft could deliver the necessary supplies. He claimed the Luftwaffe could fly in 300 tons of supplies per day, enough to sustain the trapped army. This figure was based on wildly optimistic calculations and ignored the realities of winter weather, Soviet air defenses, and available aircraft. The actual requirement was closer to 800 tons per day to keep the Sixth Army combat effective. Even maintaining minimal survival levels required at least 500 tons per day. The Luftwaffe never came close to these figures. In the best conditions, they managed to deliver about 100 tons per day. More commonly, bad weather, Soviet fighters, and anti-aircraft fire reduced deliveries to a fraction of that. The airlift was inadequate from the start, and it deteriorated as the weeks passed. Inside the pocket, German soldiers initially maintained some optimism. They had been in difficult situations before and had always been relieved or broken out. The propaganda assured them that relief was coming. But as days passed into weeks and supplies dwindled, optimism gave way to grim reality. The rations were cut, then cut again. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel for vehicles ran low, and tanks and trucks were abandoned when they ran out of fuel. Medical supplies became critically scarce. The Soviet forces surrounding the pocket were not idle. They continued attacking, trying to compress the pocket and prevent any breakout attempt. They also worked to strengthen their encirclement, building defensive positions and bringing up additional forces. The pocket was actually two rings, an inner ring facing inward toward the trapped Germans, and an outer ring facing outward to prevent relief forces from breaking through. This double encirclement made rescue almost impossible. A relief attempt did come in mid-December. Army Group Dawn, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, launched Operation Winter Storm. The plan was to drive toward Stalingrad from the southwest, break through the Soviet outer ring and establish a corridor through which the Sixth Army could escape. Manstein understood that the Sixth Army was doomed if it remained in place, and he urged Paulus to begin preparing for a breakout to meet the relief force. The relief attack initially made progress. German forces pushed to within about 50 kilometers of the pocket. For a brief moment, escape seemed possible. But Paulus would not move without explicit orders from Hitler, and Hitler would not authorize a breakout. The Sixth Army remained in place, waiting for orders that would never come, while Manstein's relief force, facing growing Soviet resistance and running low on supplies itself, was forced to retreat. By December 23rd, the relief attempt had failed, and with it went the last realistic chance for the Sixth Army to escape. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly as winter intensified. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius and lower. Soldiers who had summer uniforms or inadequate winter gear suffered terribly from the cold. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost toes, fingers, ears, and noses to the cold. Some simply froze to death in their positions, too weak from hunger and exhaustion to maintain the minimal movement necessary to survive. Horses were slaughtered for food when other rations ran out. Every horse in the pocket was eventually killed and eaten, providing brief respite from starvation, but also eliminating any remaining mobility for artillery and supplies. When the horses were gone, soldiers ate whatever they could find. Leather boots were boiled to make a kind of gelatinous substance. Any wood that could burn was used for fuel, leaving no material for cooking or warming food. Men ate their rations frozen, unable to heat them. Disease spread through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses killed men already weakened by hunger and cold. The sick and wounded lay in makeshift hospitals with inadequate medical care, their wounds going septic, their illnesses untreated for lack of medicines. Doctors and medics did what they could, but without supplies, there was little they could do except watch men die. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized they were not going to be rescued. The propaganda about relief forces coming had been exposed as lies. The airlift had proven inadequate. They were going to die in this frozen wasteland, abandoned by the leadership that had sent them there. Some soldiers, driven beyond endurance, simply walked away from their positions, wandering into no man's land where they were killed by Soviet fire or froze to death. Others committed suicide, unable to face the certainty of death by starvation or capture. Yet discipline largely held, a testament to German military training and the bonds between soldiers. Units continued to man their positions, continued to fight off Soviet probing attacks, continued to maintain some semblance of military organization even as they starved and froze. Officers and NCOs kept their men together through force of will and habit, even when there was no longer any hope. The Soviets, watching the pocket shrink as they applied pressure, prepared for a final assault. But first they offered terms. On January 8, 1943, Soviet envoys approached German lines under a flag of truce. They carried an ultimatum: surrender now with a guarantee of food, medical care, and eventual repatriation after the war, or face total annihilation. The terms were actually quite generous by the standards of the Eastern Front, where quarter was rarely asked or given. Paulus, consulting with Hitler by radio, rejected the surrender demand. Hitler had forbidden surrender, and Paulus would not disobey. The decision condemned his men to another month of suffering and death. It also condemned many more Soviet soldiers to die in the final assault, as the Soviets would have to take the pocket by force rather than accepting a negotiated surrender. The final Soviet offensive began on January 10, 1943. Operation Ring called for systematic destruction of the pocket, compressing it through a series of coordinated attacks. Soviet artillery, which had been building up for weeks, unleashed devastating bombardments. Infantry and tanks pushed forward, grinding down German resistance through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. German units, starved and outnumbered, fought with the courage of desperation but could not hold. The pocket was split, then split again. German forces were compressed into smaller and smaller areas, losing their defensive positions, losing their cohesion as units. The battle became a series of last stands, isolated groups fighting until they were overrun or out of ammunition. The Luftwaffe landing strip at Potomnik was captured on January 16th, leaving only the smaller field at Gumrak for air supply. When Gumrak fell on January 22nd, the airlift ended completely. From that point forward, the trapped soldiers received nothing from outside. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal by radio. The message was clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to fight to the death or kill himself rather than be captured. But Paulus, who had followed orders throughout his career even when he disagreed with them, finally broke with Hitler in this final moment. On January 31st, with Soviet forces outside his headquarters, he surrendered. The surrender was not universal. Some German units, not receiving word or refusing to believe it, continued fighting for several more days. The last resistance ended on February 2, 1943. Of the roughly 250,000 German and Axis soldiers trapped in the pocket, about 91,000 went into Soviet captivity. The rest had been killed, died of wounds, or died from cold and starvation. Of those 91,000 prisoners, only about 6,000 ever returned home. The rest died in Soviet prison camps, victims of disease, malnutrition, and the harsh conditions of captivity. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The cost had been almost incomprehensible. Soviet casualties for the entire battle, including the counteroffensive, exceeded 1.1 million. The news of the surrender was initially suppressed in Germany, but it couldn't be hidden for long. When the German people learned that the Sixth Army had been destroyed at Stalingrad, national morale suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered. The Eastern Front, which had seemed on the verge of victory just months before, was now revealed as a quagmire that was consuming German manpower and material at unsustainable rates. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance and eventual triumph. The city that had nearly fallen, that had been defended meter by meter through the most brutal combat imaginable, had held. More than held, it had become the site of Germany's greatest defeat. The soldiers who had fought there became heroes, their sacrifices vindicated by ultimate victory. But for those who had actually fought in the ruins, who had survived the months of hell, the victory was colored by the memory of all that had been lost. They had seen things no human should see, done things they would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. They had discovered capabilities for endurance and violence they hadn't known they possessed. They were survivors of Stalingrad, and that marked them forever. The aftermath. Counting the cost. When the guns finally fell silent in Stalingrad in early February 1943, what remained was a landscape of devastation so complete it seemed almost abstract. The city that had once been home to nearly 500,000 people was gone, replaced by an endless field of rubble stretching along the Volga River. Buildings that had survived the initial bombing and months of combat stood as skeletal ruins, their walls pockmarked by thousands of bullet impacts, their windows empty sockets staring at nothing. The snow that fell that winter covered everything in white, creating a false purity that couldn't hide the death beneath. Soviet soldiers, cautiously emerging from the defensive positions they had held for so long, found themselves walking through a graveyard. Frozen corpses lay everywhere, German and Soviet alike, some killed months earlier and simply left where they fell. The bodies would remain frozen until spring, when the thaw would create a public health crisis. Disease was already spreading among the survivors, both military and civilian. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses that thrived in conditions of poor sanitation and overcrowding killed thousands more even after the fighting stopped. The German prisoners captured in the final days presented a shocking sight. These were not the confident, well-fed soldiers who had marched into Russia 18 months earlier. They were walking skeletons, their uniforms hanging loose on emaciated frames, their eyes hollow with starvation and trauma. Many could barely walk. Some had to be carried by stronger comrades. Soviet soldiers, even those hardened by years of brutal combat, were often moved to pity by what they saw. These weren't enemies anymore, just broken human beings who had suffered beyond the limits of endurance. Processing the prisoners was a logistical nightmare. The Soviets had expected to take captives, but not in such numbers and not in such terrible condition. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Food supplies, already strained by the need to feed Soviet forces, had to be stretched to cover tens of thousands of prisoners. Many prisoners died within days or weeks of capture, their bodies too damaged by months of starvation to recover even when food became available. The march into captivity was itself deadly. Prisoners were walked eastward, away from the front lines in columns that stretched for kilometers. They marched through the same frozen landscape where they had fought, past the ruins of villages they had attacked, through territory devastated by war. The weak fell out of the columns and died by the roadside. Guards, who had their own scores to settle after years of German atrocities in the Soviet Union, were not always sympathetic. Acts of casual brutality were common, though there were also instances of guards sharing food or helping wounded prisoners. The prison camps where survivors ended up were located throughout the Soviet Union, from Siberia to Central Asia. Conditions varied, but none could be called good. Prisoners worked on construction projects, in mines, in factories. The work was hard, the food was inadequate, and medical care was minimal. Disease killed steadily. Despair killed even more as men who had survived the battle simply gave up hope of ever seeing home again. Of the 91,000 prisoners taken at Stalingrad, approximately 35,000 died within the first few months of captivity. The survivors, those who endured captivity until repatriation began in the late 1940s and early 1950s, returned to a Germany that had changed utterly. The Third Reich they had fought for was gone, replaced by occupation zones divided between the Allies. Many found their families scattered, their homes destroyed, their country transformed. They carried physical scars, frostbite damage, and old wounds that never properly healed, but also psychological scars that perhaps ran even deeper. They had nightmares about Stalingrad for the rest of their lives, unable to escape the memories of cold and hunger and death. Soviet soldiers who survived faced their own challenges. Stalin's Soviet Union was not generous to those it considered potential security risks, and soldiers who had witnessed German-held territory or been captured at any point were viewed with suspicion. Some veterans of Stalingrad found themselves interrogated by the NKVD, questioned about their actions, suspected of collaboration or cowardice. Even heroes could fall victim to Stalin's paranoia. But for those who avoided the secret police, there were honors. The defense of Stalingrad became central to Soviet identity and propaganda. Medals were distributed, titles were awarded, and survivors became living symbols of Soviet determination and sacrifice. The battle was mythologized, turned into a founding narrative of Soviet victory over fascism. Movies, books, and monuments commemorated the battle and those who fought it. The city itself was awarded the title Hero City, one of several Soviet cities that received this honor for their defense during the war. The rebuilding of Stalingrad began even before the war ended. Clearing the rubble was a massive undertaking that took years. Unexploded ordnance littered the ruins, making the work dangerous. Bodies had to be recovered and buried, though many would remain undiscovered for decades. The Volga had to be cleared of wrecked ships and boats. Infrastructure, from water mains to electrical lines to roads, had to be completely reconstructed. The rebuilt city looked different from the pre-war Stalingrad. Wide boulevards replaced the old street pattern. Soviet architecture, emphasizing grand public spaces and monumental buildings, created a city that was meant to embody Soviet power and permanence. The name Stalingrad remained until 1961, when, as part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, the city was renamed Volgograd. But the battle remained central to the city's identity. Museums, memorials, and preserved ruins kept the memory alive. The most impressive memorial is Mamayev Kurgan, a hill that had been fiercely contested during the battle and became the site of a massive memorial complex in the 1960s. The centerpiece is The Motherland Calls, a towering statue of a woman holding a sword aloft, calling her children to defense of the homeland. At 85 meters tall, it was the tallest statue in the world when completed. The memorial complex includes an eternal flame, walls inscribed with the names of defenders, and preserved trenches and bunkers from the battle. Millions of visitors have walked through the memorial, paying respects to those who fought and died there. The broader impact of Stalingrad on World War II cannot be overstated. The battle marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The destruction of the Sixth Army removed a significant portion of German combat power from the Eastern Front. The psychological impact was even greater. German soldiers and civilians had believed their military was invincible, that final victory was inevitable. Stalingrad shattered that belief. Suddenly, defeat became conceivable, and with it came doubt, fear, and the slow realization that the war might be lost. For the Allies, Stalingrad demonstrated that the Soviet Union would survive, that it could not only resist German attacks but could defeat German armies in the field. This knowledge affected strategic planning for the rest of the war. It influenced decisions about the Second Front in Western Europe, about the allocation of resources, about the post-war settlement. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of German military power and prevailed, gained enormous prestige and political capital that would shape the post-war world. Military analysts have studied Stalingrad extensively, drawing lessons about urban warfare, logistics, command decisions, and the limits of military technology. The battle demonstrated that air power alone couldn't win wars, that supply lines were critical, that urban terrain could negate advantages in mobility and firepower. It showed the importance of morale and ideology in sustaining forces through extreme hardship. It revealed the dangers of rigidity in command structures, as Hitler's refusal to allow retreat directly caused the Sixth Army's destruction. The human lessons are perhaps more profound. Stalingrad demonstrated the extremes of suffering that human beings can endure and inflict. It showed that ordinary men, pushed beyond what seems possible, can find reserves of strength and determination they never knew existed. But it also showed the costs of such extremes, the toll that such experiences exact on those who survive them. The soldiers who fought at Stalingrad, whether German or Soviet, were forever marked by the experience. They had seen humanity at its worst and sometimes at its best. They had witnessed acts of cruelty that defied comprehension and acts of courage that inspired awe. They had learned that they were capable of both killing and dying, of enduring conditions that should have broken them, of continuing to function when every rational instinct screamed to give up. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life after the war. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it was like? How do you describe the cold, the hunger, the constant fear, the casual proximity to death? How do you convey what it feels like to kill another human being at close range, to see the light go out of their eyes? Veterans of Stalingrad often found that they could only talk about their experiences with other veterans, other men who had been there and understood without explanation. The battle also raised profound questions about leadership and responsibility. Hitler's decision to order the Sixth Army to hold position rather than break out when encirclement became likely was militarily indefensible. His insistence on holding every meter of ground, his refusal to allow tactical retreats, his faith in the inadequate airlift all contributed directly to the disaster. Yet, German officers followed those orders even when they knew they were wrong, even when doing so cost the lives of their men. This raises uncomfortable questions about duty and obedience. At what point does following orders become complicity in mass murder? When does loyalty to superiors conflict with responsibility to subordinates? Paulus wrestled with these questions for the rest of his life. In Soviet captivity, he eventually joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German POWs opposed to Hitler. His decision to cooperate with his captors was controversial and earned him the label of traitor from some former comrades. But he argued that Hitler's orders at Stalingrad had been criminal, that blind obedience to such orders was itself a crime. Stalin's decisions also merit examination. Order number 2027, with its blocking detachments and penal battalions, reflected a willingness to use terror to maintain discipline. Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad were caught between German bullets in front and Soviet bullets behind. This created the conditions for desperate defense, but at a terrible human cost. The question of whether such methods were necessary or whether they represented an unnecessary level of cruelty remains debated. The civilian experience in Stalingrad is often overshadowed by the military narrative, but it deserves attention. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the battle, caught between armies, killed by bombing, artillery, or simply by the conditions of living in a war zone. Stalin's decision not to evacuate the city condemned many to death. Those who survived lived through months of unimaginable horror, hiding in basements while the battle raged overhead, scavenging for food and water, trying to protect their children from experiences no child should witness. After the war, many Stalingrad civilians carried psychological scars as deep as those of the soldiers. Children who grew up in the ruins had witnessed things that warped their understanding of normalcy. Women who had survived rape, starvation, and loss struggled to rebuild lives in the wreckage. The trauma rippled through generations, affecting children and grandchildren of survivors in ways both obvious and subtle. The physical reconstruction of Stalingrad, impressive as it was, couldn't truly erase what had happened there. The city that rose from the ruins was different from what had been destroyed. Streets ran where buildings had stood. New structures occupied spaces where old ones had been obliterated. The continuity of place was broken. Old residents who returned found a city that bore the same name but felt alien, its familiar geography erased by war and reconstruction. Yet life did continue. People returned, rebuilt, had children, went about the ordinary business of living. Markets reopened, factories resumed production, schools began teaching new generations. The remarkable resilience of human beings, their ability to continue existing even in the aftermath of catastrophe, manifested in Stalingrad as it has in devastated cities throughout history. The dead were mourned, the trauma was carried, but life pushed forward. The international attention Stalingrad received made it more than just another battle. It became symbolic, a turning point not just militarily but psychologically. The German defeat there shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Wehrmacht. It demonstrated to occupied peoples across Europe that resistance was not futile, that the Germans could be beaten. It encouraged resistance movements from France to Yugoslavia, gave hope to those suffering under Nazi occupation. In the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a rallying cry. Not one step back, the order that had sent so many men to their deaths became a slogan of resistance and determination. The soldiers who had held the city became heroes whose example was held up to inspire others. The battle demonstrated that Soviet forces, despite their earlier defeats and heavy losses, could not only stop German attacks but could annihilate German armies. This knowledge transformed Soviet morale and military confidence. The lessons of Stalingrad influenced military thinking for decades. Urban warfare doctrines developed by examining what worked and what failed in the ruins along the Volga. The importance of logistics and supply lines became a fundamental principle that military planners violated at their peril. The dangers of political interference in military decisions became a case study taught in war colleges. The battle became shorthand for a particular kind of grinding, attritional combat where determination mattered as much as technology. The Long Shadow, Legacy, and Memory. 70 years after the last shots were fired in Stalingrad, the battle continues to cast a long shadow. It remains one of the most studied military engagements in history, analyzed in books, documentaries, and academic papers. The sheer scale of the carnage, the dramatic narrative arc from German offensive to Soviet counteroffensive to final German collapse, and the strategic significance all combine to make it endlessly fascinating to military historians and general readers alike. The battle has been recreated countless times in various media. Films like Enemy at the Gates brought aspects of the battle to mainstream audiences, though often with significant creative liberties that frustrated historians. The sniper duel between Zaytsev and Koenig, for instance, has been questioned by serious researchers, but remains a popular story because it provides an individual human drama within the larger strategic narrative. Video games have recreated the battle, allowing players to experience simulated versions of the combat, though no simulation can truly convey the reality of what the actual participants endured. In Russia, the memory of Stalingrad remains central to national identity. Victory Day celebrations on May 9th each year include special recognition of Stalingrad and other key battles of what Russians call the Great Patriotic War. Veterans, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, are honored guests at these ceremonies. The Battle of Stalingrad represents Russian resilience, the ability to absorb terrible punishment and ultimately prevail. It's a source of national pride, a reminder of sacrifice and triumph over an enemy that seemed unbeatable. This memory has political dimensions as well. Russian leaders invoke Stalingrad when emphasizing Russian military power and determination. The battle serves as a reminder that Russia has survived and defeated invaders before, that attempts to conquer or humble Russia are doomed to fail. This narrative, while historically grounded, is also used to justify contemporary policies and positions. The manipulation of historical memory for political purposes is not unique to Russia, but Stalingrad is particularly potent as a symbol. In Germany, the memory of Stalingrad is more complicated and painful. For decades after the war, Stalingrad represented catastrophic defeat, the moment when the war turned irrevocably against Germany. Veterans who survived Soviet captivity returned home to a country divided and occupied, where their sacrifices seemed pointless. The question of responsibility for the disaster, of who was to blame for the decision-making that led to the encirclement and destruction of the Sixth Army, was debated extensively. Many Germans came to see Stalingrad as emblematic of Hitler's military incompetence, his refusal to listen to professional military advice, his ideological rigidity that cost hundreds of thousands of lives for no strategic gain. The battle became an argument for why absolute power should never be concentrated in the hands of one person, why military decisions should be made by military professionals rather than political leaders. This lesson, painful as it was, influenced German political and military culture in the post-war period. For military professionals worldwide, Stalingrad offers numerous case studies in what to do and what not to do. The German failure to secure their flanks with reliable troops, the overextension of supply lines, the commitment to an objective whose symbolic value outweighed its strategic importance, the refusal to allow tactical retreat when circumstances demanded it. Hitler's decision to hold Stalingrad rather than allow a breakout when encirclement occurred. All of these are studied as examples of strategic and operational mistakes. On the Soviet side, the lessons are equally instructive. The defense of urban terrain in depth, making the enemy pay for every building and every street. The importance of maintaining supply lines across the Volga despite enemy fire. The development of specialized tactics for close-quarters combat. The preparation and execution of Operation Uranus, demonstrating that the Red Army had learned from its earlier failures and could conduct sophisticated large-scale operations. The determination to hold at all costs, even when losses seemed unsustainable. The human cost of these lessons cannot be ignored. Every tactical principle drawn from Stalingrad was learned through the deaths of thousands of soldiers. Every strategic insight came at the price of human suffering on a massive scale. This creates an ethical tension in military education. The battle must be studied to understand what happened and why, to derive lessons that might prevent future catastrophes or at least make future conflicts less costly. But this study risks treating the dead as mere data points, reducing their suffering to lines on a map or numbers in a casualty report. Modern visitors to Volgograd can walk through the memorial complex at Mamayev Kurgan and get some sense of the battle's scale. The Hall of Military Glory contains an eternal flame surrounded by plaques bearing the names of thousands of Soviet defenders. The Motherland Call statue dominates the skyline, visible from throughout the city, a permanent reminder of what happened there. Preserved sections of trenches and bunkers give visitors a glimpse of what the battlefield looked like. But even these impressive memorials can only hint at the reality of the battle. They can't convey the cold that froze flesh and turned breath to ice crystals. They can't reproduce the sound of artillery bombardments that lasted hours, the physical pressure of noise that made thought impossible. They can't recreate the smell of death and decay that permeated the ruins. They can't transmit the fear, the exhaustion, the hunger, the psychological trauma of living through such an experience. Some artifacts from the battle have been preserved in museums. Rifles and machine guns, uniforms and equipment, personal items taken from the dead. Letters written by soldiers in their final days, knowing they would not survive. Photographs taken during the battle, showing landscapes of utter devastation. These objects provide tangible connections to the past, reminders that the battle wasn't abstract but involved real people with lives and families and hopes. Archaeological work continues in Volgograd, uncovering remains and artifacts that were missed during the post-war cleanup. Every year, remains of soldiers are found in the ruins, identified when possible through dental records or identification tags, and given proper burial. This work provides some closure for families who never knew what happened to their relatives, but it also serves as a reminder that the battle's traces remain, literally buried beneath the modern city. The debate over how to remember Stalingrad continues. Should the emphasis be on Soviet heroism and sacrifice, or should the German suffering also be acknowledged? Should civilians killed in the battle receive equal recognition with soldiers, or does military service merit special honor? How should the battle be taught to new generations who have no personal connection to World War II? These questions don't have simple answers, and different groups answer them differently based on their perspectives and interests. What's undeniable is that the Battle of Stalingrad changed the course of World War II and thereby changed the course of world history. If the Germans had taken Stalingrad and secured the Volga, if they had driven into the Caucasus and seized the oil fields, the war might have lasted longer and ended differently. If the Sixth Army had been allowed to break out rather than being encircled and destroyed, German strength in the East would have been significantly greater in 1943 and beyond. The battle mattered, and the outcome mattered, in ways that rippled through subsequent decades. The soldiers who fought at Stalingrad, both German and Soviet, were ordinary men caught up in extraordinary circumstances. They were not inherently heroes or villains, though individuals certainly performed heroic acts or committed atrocities. They were human beings pushed to extremes, forced to discover what they were capable of when survival itself was in question. Some rose to heights of courage and self-sacrifice. Others broke under the strain. Most simply endured day after day, doing what they had to do to stay alive. Their story deserves to be remembered, not romanticized or sanitized, but told as honestly as possible. They fought in conditions that beggar imagination, suffered in ways that still shock those who learn about them, and died in numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend. The lucky ones survived, carried their trauma home, and tried to build lives in a world that could never understand what they had experienced. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as one of history's great cautionary tales about the costs of war, the consequences of hubris and ideology, and the limits of human endurance. It demonstrates that even the strongest armies can be defeated, that even the most carefully laid plans can fail catastrophically, that war creates suffering out of proportion to any political or strategic objective. These lessons, learned in blood on the banks of the Volga in 1942 and 1943, remain relevant today. Conclusion: Remembering Hell. As we reach the end of this journey through one of history's most brutal battles, it's worth pausing to consider what the Battle of Stalingrad means today, 8 decades after the guns fell silent. The numbers are staggering. Nearly 2 million casualties, military and civilian combined. An entire German army annihilated. A city reduced to rubble. But numbers alone can't capture the reality of what happened there. Stalingrad was personal. It was the soldier freezing in a foxhole, wondering if he would survive until morning. It was the sniper waiting hours for the perfect shot, knowing that his target was someone's son or husband or father. It was the defender in a ruined building, fighting for a position whose strategic value had long since ceased to matter, fighting simply because retreat meant death and surrender was unthinkable. It was the civilian, huddled in a basement, listening to the battle rage overhead, praying that the ceiling wouldn't collapse, that a stray shell wouldn't find their hiding place. The battle demonstrated several fundamental truths about war and human nature. First, that technological superiority and professional military skill are not sufficient to guarantee victory. The Germans had better trained soldiers in many cases, superior optics and precision equipment, a tradition of military excellence. But they couldn't overcome Soviet determination, Soviet willingness to accept catastrophic casualties, and Soviet advantages in numbers and industrial production. Technology matters, but it's not everything. Second, that urban warfare is fundamentally different from open battlefield combat. In the ruins of Stalingrad, the advantages that had made the German blitzkrieg so successful became liabilities. Tanks were vulnerable in narrow streets. Air power was less effective against defenders who simply went underground. Coordination between units became difficult in the maze of rubble. The city itself became a weapon that Soviet defenders wielded effectively against an enemy ill-prepared for that kind of fighting. Third, that logistics ultimately determine outcomes more than battlefield heroics. The Germans lost at Stalingrad not primarily because of failures in combat, but because they couldn't sustain their forces. Supply lines were overextended. The airlift failed. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements couldn't reach the troops who needed them. Meanwhile, the Soviets, despite operating across the Volga under constant German fire, maintained their supply lines well enough to keep fighting. Superior logistics defeated superior tactics. Fourth, that leadership decisions have consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate moment. Hitler's refusal to allow retreat or breakout when encirclement threatened. His insistence on holding symbolic objectives regardless of cost. His interference in operational decisions that should have been left to commanders on the ground. These decisions directly caused the destruction of the Sixth Army and significantly altered the course of the war. The same could be said of Stalin's Order No. 227, with its brutal enforcement mechanisms that left Soviet soldiers no choice but to fight or die. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, that war extracts costs that extend far beyond the battlefield and long after the fighting stops. The men who fought at Stalingrad, those who survived, carried psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. The civilians who endured the battle were marked forever by what they experienced. The families of the dead lived with loss that could never be filled. The costs of war compound over time, affecting generations who never personally experienced the conflict but inherited its trauma. Understanding Stalingrad requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. We can recognize Soviet heroism and sacrifice while also acknowledging the brutality of Stalin's regime. We can understand German soldiers as human beings caught up in circumstances beyond their control, while also recognizing that they were fighting for an evil cause. We can honor the courage displayed by soldiers on both sides, while also questioning the decisions that put them in positions where such courage was necessary. History is complex, and reducing it to simple narratives of good and evil, heroes and villains, misses important nuances. The battle also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what human beings are capable of. The cruelty, the casual violence, the capacity to inflict suffering on others, but also the courage, the self-sacrifice, the determination to endure even when endurance seems impossible. Stalingrad brings out extremes, shows us humanity at its worst and its best, often in the same moment. This duality is part of what makes the battle so compelling and so disturbing. For those of us who study and learn about Stalingrad from the safety and comfort of peace, there's a responsibility that comes with that knowledge. We must remember not just the strategic outcomes and the historical significance, but the human beings who lived through and died in the battle. We must resist the temptation to romanticize their suffering or to reduce their experiences to entertainment. We must try, however imperfectly, to understand what they went through and to honor their memory by learning from their experiences. The lessons of Stalingrad extend beyond military strategy and tactics. They touch on fundamental questions of human nature, political leadership, the costs of ideology, and the consequences of decisions made in distant capitals by leaders who never experienced the realities their orders created. These lessons remain relevant today in a world that still sees conflicts, still debates the use of military force, still struggles with questions of when and how to fight. If Stalingrad teaches us anything, it should be that war, even when necessary, comes at costs that are often underestimated by those who start them and that fall most heavily on those least responsible for the conflicts. The soldiers who froze and starved in Stalingrad didn't start World War II. They didn't decide that Germany should invade the Soviet Union or that the Soviet Union should resist to the last man. They simply found themselves in the situation and did what they had to do to survive, following orders, fulfilling duties, trying to stay alive one more day. The city itself has moved on. Modern Volgograd is a living city of nearly 1 million people, not just a memorial to past battles. People work there, raise families, live ordinary lives. But the memory remains, woven into the city's identity, visible in the monuments and memorials, present in the stories passed down through generations. Stalingrad happened. It cannot be undone or forgotten. It remains part of human history, part of the record of what we are capable of doing to each other. As we remember the battle, we honor not just the victors, but all who suffered there. German soldiers who died far from home, fighting for a cause that history has rightly condemned. Soviet soldiers who gave everything to defend their homeland. Civilians caught between armies, killed through no fault of their own. All of them deserve to be remembered as human beings, not just as numbers in casualty reports or pieces moved across strategic maps. The Battle of Stalingrad was hell. It was hell frozen over in the Russian winter, hell that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, hell that left survivors marked for life. We study it not to glorify war, but to understand it, to learn from it, to hopefully avoid repeating the mistakes that made such a battle possible. We remember it because forgetting would dishonor those who died there and risk allowing similar catastrophes in the future. If you've made it this far in this video, thank you for taking the time to learn about this critical moment in history. Understanding battles like Stalingrad helps us understand the costs of war and the resilience of the human spirit. These stories matter, not just as historical facts but as reminders of what was sacrificed and what was survived. If you found this video informative, please consider giving it a like. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into World War II history. And share this with anyone you think would appreciate learning about one of history's most significant battles. The memory of Stalingrad and those who fought there deserves to be preserved and passed on to future generations. Until next time, remember the past so we can build a better future.